Again, as Andy mentioned, I think you are all certainly looking forward to hearing what Paul has to say, so which comes right after this. So I think, George, we're between that numbers and what everybody want to hear, right? So with that, well, so thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you. And for those of you who haven't met George or haven't come across some of the things he's done, George is the vice chairman for Lazard. He's the global head of their energy, power, and infrastructure business. And I think under George's leadership, many of you probably use this levelized cost of energy analysis for solar and wind, and what that has done. He's really the mastermind behind that, and that has become a de facto industry standard. So, and George has obviously been at Sempra, he's been at KKR, he was at Cravath as a partner. So when it comes to energy, power, and more specifically renewable energy industry, so I thought that it'd be great to hear some of George's perspective on how he sees the green hydrogen industry landscape unfolding, how capital formation might play out, and what are the parallels maybe we can all draw from what has happened to the solar and wind industry. So with that, George, maybe the first question here, right, is help us draw, so look, when we first were looking at solar and some of the DOE loan guarantee program, where we're sort of in the same organization, right? It was very different times and costs were high, somewhat prohibitive. The PPAs were much higher level, but today solar and wind prices have fallen as much as it has. So what would you say to people in terms of what parallel can we draw between what happened to the LCO of solar and wind, given your experience, and where do you see the whole green hydrogen industry going now that we're all been talking about this IRA and PTC and things like that?
So first, thank you. It's great to be here, and the room is filled with optimism. And I don't know if I was on mic when I said to Andy what I thought about his presentation, but it's just great. It's really inspirational. But when everyone was fretting about where the legislation was going or not going, what we were saying to people who called us about it was the most important thing to put in this legislation is something for hydrogen, because it will let the industry scale. And we've woken up in the middle of a great American industrial policy in some ways without us really realizing it. And what we think is going to happen with hydrogen is it's going to scale, costs are going to go down, and the time frame for adoption, realistic adoption across the different use cases has just been dramatically accelerated because of the Inflation Reduction Act. We do a quarterly series with CFOs across the utility industry, and we invite folks from Plug to this as well. And yesterday we did this session. There's a slide in the materials we gave the group that shows by use case, just about every use case is acceptable from a cost perspective by the middle of this decade and earlier. So hugely important, and that's before you take into account the observation Andy made about, I now don't quite recall it, but when we double the number of units we have in the field, our costs go down by X.
25.
So that's, we're going to
25%.
25%. So we're going to see that, and it's exactly what happened in the solar industry. So this isn't quite the right comparison, and it's an imperfect comparison, but whatever you think about the German feed-in tariff for the solar industry, it allowed the industry to scale and began the great cost down in the industry along with the subsidies in the United States.
So George, I think Lazard played obviously a very big role in terms of advising DOE on many things as well. So there is lots of activity going on with the loan guarantee program, even for the hydrogen industry. I think, was that really the impetus, if you would, to get the back leverage and the project financing started for the solar and wind? Walk us through the journey of how that played out, right? The first folks from First Solar SunPower got some of the loan guarantee program, then now all of a sudden solar is an investable asset class, cap structure had changed. To talk about that a little bit as to how do you think it's all going to unfold?
So I think the fellow running the loan program, Jigar Shah, is incredibly thoughtful and passionate. He has a very good team around him. I think it is the equivalent of a lending institution's team and will be very effective. And there's going to be places where the capital's not quite ready to form, where the DOE can provide a wrap or some support right now to allow the capital to flow, so their capital is not necessary in the future. So there is no need for subsidies or for loan guarantees or loan support in the wind and solar and storage industry. It's just happening. The capital is going to flow, and I think there's probably going to be some places where it's going to make sense for the DOE and other state state governments, local governments to provide support.
Okay. So now we are in a pretty interesting time as well, right? So the rates are rising. Maybe it's a short-term phenomenon, maybe it's a long-term phenomenon, and obviously you and Lazard obviously do a lot of work with the infrastructure funds, private equity funds. Has that changed their view on what is that equity return that they're looking for, maybe even for solar and wind? Is that going to end up impacting the cost of capital for green hydrogen build-out? How do you see that playing out?
So it's you can look at some recent transactions, and it's as if nothing's happened in the capital markets. But we think cost of capital will go up, but we don't think it's going to make a difference to the energy transition and what Plug Power is going to try to accomplish. I mean, there is not a capital formation or a capital access program around the energy transition. It's going to flow. The issue with the uncertainty with the legislation this year was really quite interesting because people just needed to know what the rules were. I'll put aside hydrogen for a moment, but in solar and wind and storage, people just needed to know what the rules were, and then the money was going to flow. And the problem with the uncertainty was no one knew how to price the investment. Yep. And what we also said with the presidential election, that we didn't think it mattered ultimately who was the president vis-a-vis the energy transition, because the human race is driving this thing, and it's just going to happen.
Okay. So you really don't think the rising rates is really going to end up raising the rates or the equity returns?
Oh yeah, it's going to raise their equity returns, but I don't think it's going to matter for projects and efforts that make sense. But if the yield curve steepens, which isn't what the market is predicting right now, but if the yield curve steepens, I mean, people are going to plug that into their model, and cost of capital is going to increase. But at the same time, the Inflation Reduction Act, other developments, general acceptance of the energy transition across multiple areas will offset that.
Got it.
And the infrastructure capital is incredibly interesting. We just did this thing with Intel, on behalf of Intel with Brookfield. So Brookfield's putting $15 billion into a new fab with Intel. There's going to be more of those sorts of things. So there remains almost a capital deployment problem if you've got the capital. So I'm not worried. We're just not worried about this.
That is good to hear, because it's one of the questions I'm sure many of the investors here have in their mind, right? Is the cost of capital going to really jeopardize the economics?
I just have to make one caveat, which relates to the last point that Andy was making, which is we're in an incredibly uncertain geopolitical environment. It is highly dangerous, incredibly risky. So the caveat on all this capital access stuff is, we have a situation in Europe that is almost unmanageable, and we freely talk about the potential for nuclear weapons to be used, and that there's a big geopolitical problem.
Understood.
Yep.
Yeah. So George, in this sort of a commodity environment, supply chain environment, obviously there's been some upward pressure to the renewable prices, right? Well, how do you see that trending when you look 5 years out? Because that's so critical for the cost of green hydrogen going forward. Can you give us your sense on that?
So we are delaying the publication of our LCOE this year because the data is so bad and costs are all over the place.
That's right.
But costs have gone up for renewables, but not as much as other forms of energy. And we think that the cost profile of renewables will not go down at the same pace because they're so low already, but they'll stabilize to continue to decline. We also think a lot of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act is going to get passed on to the customer and get priced into projects. So for a little bit, maybe a year or two, different projects will be more profitable, but the competitive dynamic is going to compete the Inflation Reduction Act benefit out of the renewables generation space. Developers will drive down to the returns they've been targeting, as opposed to the returns they'd be getting if they were keeping all the Inflation Reduction Act benefit.
Yeah, so directionally, you still think the price will continue to go down?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we think about sort of that $10 to $15 a megawatt hour wind in West Texas, that's not out of possibility.
Oh, right? That's not going anywhere.
That's not.
The efficiencies continue to be garnered around the costs that go into renewable generation, whether it's through the EPC. Wind turbines continue to get better. Solar, there are ongoing solar efficiencies, and integrating battery storage into these projects, particularly solar. Like we don't even look at standalone solar anymore because everyone's putting storage around it. That's getting better and better too.
Got it. I mean, so George, it's quite exciting for us. Last year, I believe we became one of the top buyers of renewable electricity, one of the top 10 buyers of renewable electricity in Texas, right? So when you talk to all the major energy companies, all the pipeline companies, all the utilities, right? What are they saying about what role do they think they should play or they want to play in this whole green hydrogen ecosystem?
So I just take one step back. I think that the sophisticated utility executive or energy executive would say, we're going to decarbonize the world, and there are going to be about 10 things that happen.
Yeah.
It's not one thing, 10 things, and we're going to need fossil fuels for a while.
Yeah.
And they accept that hydrogen is one of those 10 things and is growing in materiality. And they're all trying to figure out, I think the level of understanding of hydrogen is sort of where people were 15 to 17 years ago on renewables when you're in the utility industry. I mean, very sophisticated. NextEra, super sophisticated, but others, I think, still trying to learn it and understand it and figure out how to deploy that for the benefit of the customers.
Okay.
But there is zero resistance from the utilities to energy transition stuff. The resistance that you find with the utilities is just around managing costs for ratepayers, which is an issue in this industry. And then for the big oil and gas companies, this is adjacent to what they're good at. Yep. And so there'll be more and more focus on this area and a desire to participate in this area. And also people need to figure out a way, these pipeline companies, we got to figure out a way to move hydrogen around. Yep. So they're logical partners for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, George, we might not have a lot of time is the signal I'm getting from Teal here. So, so just to wrap up, right? I mean, I think cost of capital, despite the near-term environment, should be okay. Right. We will see capital formation with sort of similar cap structure like what we saw in solar and wind, right? I think, so now do you envision a scenario where there is a new energy giants that evolves, right, in this whole ecosystem of wind, solar, everything that has happened, and how do you see that, right? Where does the utility fit? Where does a traditional energy company fit? Because it's a disruptive technology, if you would, right? A new entrant probably is thinking differently. So how does that ecosystem look like in your mind as one of the most prominent and a thoughtful banker 10 years out?
I think you're going to, companies that we think are leaders and will continue to grow. NextEra is a very, very good company, very strong, very good new CEO. They are a energy transition super major. Total is very committed to this. They're still in traditional energy, but their migration in the energy transition will continue to grow. I think that there are one or two other, three other large oil companies who, BP, Shell, all are, you see BP just bought Archaea yesterday, the day before. And then there's going to, I'm not sure, but there's going to be some others who emerge in the area that don't exist yet because the total addressable market's so large. So your total addressable market is enormous. It's not inconceivable to see you filling up a large portion of that total addressable market. If you capitalize that future prospect and bring it back to today, the market still isn't recognizing your value potential. So the answer is I don't know, but I think some of these big traditional energy companies are going to fill this space because of the complexity of the projects, the need to be able to gather capital, to take a lot of risk, construction risk and things like that.
Yeah, and as you said, hopefully we're one of those biggest players as well, and that's what we're trying to do, right? No, that's the work we're trying to accomplish. No. George, well, thank you so much for taking the trip and being here with us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.